Well, it's 5 o'clock somewhere, and that must mean it's time for another Food for Thought Friday. Well, folks, with many organizations headed into Q4, performance appraisals are nearly right around the corner. And love them, hate them, or find yourself somewhere in between, one thing is certain, performance appraisals are not going anywhere anytime soon. Now, if you don't already know, I've got a passion for bridging the gap between scientific scholarly research, particularly in the area of behavioral sciences, and real-world, real-life practical application. And so this week, I was able to get my hands on an article called Evaluating Our Evaluations, Recognizing and Countering Performance Evaluation Pitfalls. This is a fun piece to read because it comes from the United States Military Academy Digital Commons. The two authors on this paper are Lieutenant Colonel Evans, an assistant professor and an associate program director in the Department of Mathematical Sciences at the United States Military Academy, and Lieutenant Colonel Robinson, who's a commander of the 603rd Aviation Support Battalion at Hunter Army Airfield in Savannah, Georgia. As always, I'm going to get a screenshot of that somewhere here on the screen. I'm going to read a few sections of this paper just to set the context. Opening quote. Selecting the right person for the right job at the right time is a persistent challenge faced by organizations. Performance evaluations are a fundamental component of selection process, and their use in the Army is nearly as old as the service itself. Some early evaluation systems consisted of a list of officers in a regiment, with observations noted for each ranging from a good-natured man to merely good, nothing promising, to a man, all whom unite in speaking ill. While our current evaluation form adds a bit more science to the art of performance evaluation, a constant in the Army's performance evaluation system is the reliance on raters to render their judgments on the potential of a subordinate in the service at higher levels. We focus on the process of discretionary judgment exercised by raters that is, and will continue to be, an integral part of the performance evaluation. Our aim is to recognize the structural and cognitive biases inherent in our evaluation system and provide recommendations to help senior raters more objectively evaluate their subordinates. While the performance of an officer is undoubtedly important to his or her chances of promotion and selection, the ability of the officer's senior rater to convey the level of this performance through an evaluation is also vital to talent management. Closing quote. Okay, so there we go. Now, the authors in this paper, they outlined their concerns with the current popular performance management methodologies practiced in the service, as well as civilian context, stating that forced distribution models, and especially those based on a normal distribution curve, often introduce measurement error by necessity and by design. So that's a mouthful. So let's unpackage what that means exactly. If you're not familiar with a normal distribution curve, it represents a distribution, statistical distribution, in which the mean, the median, and the mode are approximately equal. And I'm going to, I think, maybe give you an example here on the screen of a normal distribution curve. Because according to this approach, the normal distribution curve, there's something in statistics called the empirical rule. And what it means here, and I'll show you on the screen, is that on a normal distribution, roughly 68% of the population will fall within one standard deviation of above and 1 standard deviation below the population mean for a given construct. Is that confusing? Probably. Okay, so check out this graphic somewhere here on the screen. 68% fall below. Now you see the 0 mark on the graphic. That's the mean, the median, and the mode in a normal distribution. The average. Average performance. And according to a normal distribution, you got +1 and -1 on the graph there on the graphic. That's 1 standard deviation above the average, 1 standard deviation below, and 68.26% of people should fall into that grouping. So using the graph then to explain performance, it would be expected that 68% of the organization's population would be in the middle area, representing 1 standard deviation above and below the average, or the mean mark. Again, following this example, we would expect that 95% of the organization's population to fall within 2 standard deviations of the mean, and 99.7% to fall within 3 standard deviations of the mean. That's how normal distribution operates. So practically speaking, if performance were normally distributed within a given population, and that's another discussion for a whole different day, it would be expected that 15.85% of an organization's population would be force ranked as a level C player, 68% as B players, and 15.85% as A level players, all other things being equal. Now, unfortunately, this methodology only works in sample sizes greater than 30 for statistical reasons that I'm not going to get into right now. But if you want, if you're interested in, well, why is that? Go ahead and Google the statistical law of large numbers. Have fun with that. Should explain why that takes place. In essence, however, any sample smaller than 30 taken from a larger organizational population may or may not have a performance distribution which reflects the normal distribution curve in a broader organization. In other words, if your organization has, let's say as an example, 500,000 people, but your team has 5, although on the larger organizational 500,000 people grouping, that's the population, you might see that performance is normally distributed. Your team specifically might not fit nicely into that. Okay. So that's what that kind of means. Now, suppose, for an example, you manage a team of 5 employees. Well, according to that normal distribution assumption, this means that 68.26% of your employees of 5, right, should be rated as average. 68% of your team of 5 should be rated as average. So what does it mean? 3.4% of your 5 employees should be rated as average. Well, there's no such thing as 3.4% of an employee. So we're gonna round down. Okay, so in your team of 5, 3 employees are should be force rated. That's what we call forced distribution. Should be force rated as average. As average. So we're going to round down. On a team of 5, only 0.79%, or sorry, not percentage, only 0.79 employees should receive a rating above average. So again, we got to round up. There's no such thing as a 0.79 of an employee. There's 1 employee. So okay, so even with the rounding up, this gives us quite a jump from 1 in 5. 1 in 5 being the 0.79 rounded up to 1. 1 in 5 employees, so for 20%, up from 0.79 in 5, which is 15.8%. So I hope I'm not overly confusing in this, but these numbers maybe seem trivial in a team of 5, but imagine the horrors when we use numbers in the thousands. If each team of 5 is off in the statistic, let's go ahead and extrapolate that 100-fold. A forced distribution model, a forced distribution scale, by design, results in a statistical error, and hundreds of employees receive a performance rating potentially lower than they deserve. The downside, let's look at this practically speaking. If hundreds of team members receive a performance rating lower than what they actually deserve, because we have to force people into this model, the downside is that when effort doesn't result in appropriately scaled reward, employees cease to put in the effort. And leaders end up with teams who perform to the level of their ratings rather than the level of their potential. And why wouldn't they? Why would you continue to put in additional discretionary effort if you know that the model forces you into a rating that doesn't adequately reflect your effort? You're going to say, okay, fine. Then if I'm rated as a C, then I'm going to perform to a C, even though my potential is to perform to the level of an A. Making sense? I hope so. Lieutenant Colonel Evans and Lieutenant Carl Robinson suggest one approach to overcome this system of rating error, which is to rank all employees not within the context of the team. So we got a team of 5, and we know well only one person can be highly performing, but rather to rate your team within the context of the broader organization. This is not, however, a silver bullet. Some teams of 5 may very well contain 4 to 5 performers in the high end of the distribution. And although a statistical anomaly within the small team sample population, in reality this may be the case if there's another team that's stacked with performers who are low on the distribution curve. So, as unfortunate as the normal distribution assumption is, it might be the best that we have at this time. So the authors then note 4 cognitive biases. So we've talked about the potential systemic errors, and the authors say, well, okay, to address this then, instead of rating your team against themselves, rate your team against the whole entire broader organization, and that might decrease potential for rating error. Okay, fair enough. The authors say, but hold on, but wait, there's more. There are also 4 biases that we need to be aware of that may prevent appraisals. Our awareness might prevent appraisals from being hijacked by bias. So number 1, the halo effect. And I'll just pull from the article, opening quote, as the name implies, halo effects occur when we use performance in one dimension to influence our evaluation of a person in all other dimensions. An officer who performs well in the attribute of competence by projecting self-confidence. And, man, I gotta pause there because there's a huge chasm between competence and confidence, but that's for another video. I'll carry on. An officer who performs well in the attribute of competence by projecting self-confidence and by a commanding presence may enjoy a positive halo effect across other competencies and attributes. Ending or closing quote. What does that mean? Well, it means if I'm very confident and I have an executive presence, the halo effect or the halo bias would lead my supervisor to rate me high in all aspects of performance. whether or not I actually rate high on those other constructs. Making sense? I do hope so. That's halo effect. The second bias is first impression error. Opening quote. This bias stems from an initial impressions, either favorable or unfavorable, that influence the rater's evaluation. Similar to halo effects, the primary problem of initial impression error is that a rater may suppress or discount subsequent information about a ratee if it's counter to their initial impression. In other words, you meet me for the first time, you're my supervisor, I leave a negative or a poor first impression, then no matter how well I perform following that first impression, right, that would be subsequent evidence to suggest my adequate or superior performance. You're always going to default to that first impression, right? So the rater will suppress or discount subsequent information about the ratee if it's counter to the initial first impression. That's bias number 2. Bias number 3 is called similar to me effect. Opening quote, this bias stems from a tendency of some raters to judge a person favorably when he or she resembles the rater along dimensions such as his or her attitude or background. Closing quote. So this is where a rater, a supervisor, doesn't rate the performance based on actual objective, measurable criteria, but rather go, okay, I think this person's a high performer. Why? Well, you feel that way intuitively because they're similar to you in some aspect. You're outgoing, they're outgoing. You're loud, they're loud. You're of a specific cultural background, they're of a specific cultural background. And so you prefer that person who is similar to you, and you erroneously give them, let's say, a rating that is ballooned, that is greater than it should be. That's called the similar to me effect. Then we have what's called the central tendency error, and the central, we'll just pull from the paper because they explain it well. Opening quote. The central tendency error occurs when raters score most ratees as average, or slightly above average. Closing quote. And although this sounds like a contradiction within the context of a normal distribution, where I've already told you people have to be forced into that normal distribution curve, and according to normal distribution, the majority of the people will be rated as average. Although this seems like a contradiction within that context, okay? This bias is demonstrated regardless of the normal distribution curve being used. And this is where a supervisor will rate their team members and go, well, I don't want to seem overly generous, or I don't want to seem overly miserly, so, well, we'll fall somewhere here in the middle for everybody. That's a rating error. That is a bias and a rating error. And the last one then is called the duration effect, and I'll just pull from the article again. So opening quote, the essence of duration neglect is the tendency to place greater emphasis on peak time periods and recency when recalling events. So raters commit this error, right? They might only look at to the mid-year reviews and maybe the past 4 weeks when assessing year-end performance, rather than to analyze the whole year's performance in totality. Okay, so there are the structural errors in the system. There are the biases, the cognitive errors in the system. And in this article, the authors make the following recommendations to overcome structural issues and cognitive biases. Number 1, the authors suggest that you rank employees' performance across the broader organizational population. So instead of rating it on a distribution curve on your team, rate it across the entire organization. So perhaps you work in a setting where that's the practice and you wonder, well, why am I being rated again? Well, that's why. It's to decrease the potential for statistical error. Suggestion number 2 is to triangulate the ratings from multiple raters. And perhaps you work in an organization where the supervisor will give a rating, and then somebody else or other parties will offer their ratings. And perhaps this is done within the context of a 360-degree feedback rating. Well, that is why. To triangulate the ratings from multiple raters. Why? Because if one rater has innate bias, if we have multiple raters, that should start to narrow and decrease the potential that any one rater has innate bias. Okay, so triangulate the ratings for multiple raters. That's suggestion number 2. Suggestion number 3 is provide frequent feedback throughout the performance cycle to increase clarity around expectations. A team member should never get their mid-year or their year-end rating and go, "Oh my gosh, I'm blindsided. I really didn't know I was trending that way." Provide frequent feedback throughout the performance cycle to increase clarity around expectations. Those are the 3 recommendations. Those are the 4 plus 1 potential errors in the rating system itself and the cognitive process. There you go. There you have it. Love them, hate them, or find yourself somewhere in between. One thing is certain, performance appraisals are not going away anytime soon. So let's do right by our teams. Let's decrease error inherent in the system by recognizing and then accounting for the biases mentioned above. As always, I hope this helps. And if nothing else, perhaps this has been at least food for thought. Follow me for more.